If you love chilling mysteries, unsolved cases, and a touch of mom-style humor, Moms and Mysteries is the podcast you've been searching for. Hey guys, I'm Mandy.
And I'm Melissa. Join us every Tuesday for Moms and Mysteries, your gateway to gripping, well-researched true crime stories. Each week, we deep dive into a variety of mind-boggling cases as we shed light on everything from heists to whodunits. We're your go-to podcast for mysteries with a motherly touch. Subscribe now to Moms and Mysteries wherever you get your podcasts.
Did you just hear those ads? Do you not want to? Because Crimelines is available ad-free on Supercast, Patreon, and Apple subscriptions. You will also get access to my other twice-monthly podcast, Beyond the Files. That's where I take cases that were covered on Forensic Files and tell you the rest of the story. Links to those platforms are in the show notes. Thirteen-year-old Brandy Lynn Myers left her apartment building, walked through her neighborhood, and never came home. 23 years later, a witness came forward who broke the case open, and 9 years after that, her suspected killer broke his silence on the case. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome to Crimelines. The case we're covering today is one that is very close to my heart. This is the third podcast I have had in which I have covered this case. And if I have 100 more podcasts, get ready to hear this case 100 more times. I learned about this case when I was first connected with Brandy Myers' older sister, Kristen, years ago. I interviewed her to cover the case, and that turned into the start of a friendship. For years, I have just admired Kristen and what she has done in her life, both related to the case, but also just her day-to-day life as a super mom to her children. But I know that this case still weighs on her, even though she knows what happened to Brandy, she just hasn't gotten real justice yet. I decided it was time to cover this again because there have been some pretty recent updates in this case. I will say that this episode covers Brandy's case at the core, but it intersects with a few other cases we'll stop and talk about, but I promise each time we are going to bring it back to Brandy. So with that, let's get started with Brandy Myers, who was born on March 13th, 1979, to Cheryl and Daryl Myers. About 2 years later, her sister Kristen was born, and while the girls were still little, their parents divorced. Cheryl had full custody of the girls, and they eventually settled with their stepfather Lester in the Sunny Slope area of Phoenix, Arizona. They were renting an apartment while the girls went to Sunny Slope Elementary, and in 1992, Brandy was 13 years old and she was a sixth grader. Brandy loved school in spite of it being a struggle. She had learning disabilities, and sometimes she would even get picked on. But she did have friends who accepted her as she was, and Kristen told me years ago that the nature of Brandy's learning disabilities wasn't such that it would have held her back in life on the whole. And I really get that. I have a child who dealt with pretty significant and pervasive learning disabilities, and he's an adult now, and I can see how all those interventions and strategies along the way added up to him being an adult who can pursue his goals. And that's really what Kristen thought would happen with Brandy. She did get special education interventions to help with her progress, and because Brandy loved animals so much, Kristen could really see her working in the veterinary field one day. In all, Brandy was a happy 13-year-old, although a bit more naive than the average teenager. So she was 13, but she was a young 13. Both Cheryl and Lester worked past school hours, so Brandy and Kristen had a set routine. They would walk home from school together and then play at the apartment complex until their parents got home. There was a neighbor who would keep an eye on them and be there if they needed anything, but mostly they just ran around playing. And I'm going to say they did that pretty much every day, and I mean every day. Unless one of them got in trouble and got grounded, Kristen said it would usually be her, they would both be outside. And I would say rain or shine, but this is Phoenix, so we're talking shine all the time. And the best time to be outside was during the school year when the temperatures were, by Phoenix's measures, moderate. because the summers when they had long days to run around and explore could be pretty brutal. I mean, as I'm recording this, it's 100 degrees in Phoenix, and it's about 8:30 in the morning. So it's no surprise that on Tuesday, May 26th, 1992, Brandy and Kristen walked home from school, as was their routine, and then headed outside to play. Brandy had recently participated in a school readathon where neighbors would pledge a certain amount of money per page she read or per minute. And this readathon was a fundraiser for a field trip that the class was going on the last day of school. And Brandy was very excited about this. And she was so proud of herself because she had earned $13 in pledges. The money had been due at the school already, but Brandy still had a few pledges she hadn't collected. And she really wanted to finish it up because the field trip was the following week. It was a matter of $6 or $7, and her stepfather, Lester, told the Arizona Republic back in 1992 that he or Cheryl would have just given her the money if she asked. But Brandy really took the fundraiser seriously, and she wanted to go collect the rest of the pledges that she had earned. That day, though, Brandy couldn't find the address list of the people who had pledged. The school probably had it because Brandy would have turned it in with the money she had already collected. But Brandy was pretty confident she knew which houses she needed to go to. It's not like she had trawled the whole neighborhood signing people up for pledges. Cheryl had only allowed her to go to houses between their apartment and their school, so a couple of blocks. These were houses that Brandy and Kristen passed every day and more or less were familiar with most of the people there. On that Tuesday after school, Brandy wanted Kristen to go with her to collect the money, but Kristen didn't want to go. She was 11, and she had a crush on a boy who was hanging out outside the complex, so she wanted to stay. She was annoyed with Brandy that day, so she told Brandy she was a nerd and she didn't want to be seen hanging out with her, so she wasn't going. Brandy told the neighbor who was keeping an eye on them that she was heading out to collect the pledges, and this babysitter knew that Cheryl had previously given permission for her to do it, so she let her go. This would have been roughly 5 p.m. Kristen remembers watching Brandy walk away from the apartment complex and head in the direction of the school. Brandy was wearing a green t-shirt, a jean skirt, and pink high tops. And she was wearing her glasses, which had thick lenses, and they were in that oversized style that was popular in the 90s. At 6:30, Cheryl came home from work, and Brandy wasn't home yet. After checking with the friends in the apartment complex and not finding Brandy, Cheryl got in her car to drive around the neighborhood and look for her. It seemed unlikely that Brandy would still be out collecting money an hour and a half later, but maybe she stopped to play with a classmate or something. When Cheryl couldn't find her in the neighborhood, she called the police. Brandy was not the type of child who lost track of time and didn't come home for dinner. She was always there when Cheryl got home from work, so it was alarming that she wasn't. And then, as it started getting dark, Brandy's family knew something must be wrong. Brandy had a visual impairment that made it difficult for her to see in the dark, even with her glasses. Because of this, even though she was 13, she was still afraid of being outside in the dark, particularly if she was alone. The police came out to the neighborhood and began to search. They didn't think Brandy was a runaway, but perhaps she did go to a friend's house without permission and didn't think to check in with her mom. No one reported hearing or seeing anything to suggest an abduction, but it really wasn't like Brandy not to be home when she was supposed to, as in time for dinner. The next morning, when the sun came up and Brandy still hadn't been found, the search picked up, which included an air search, police swarming the neighborhood and looking in people's backyards and outbuildings, and even looking in people's cars. Over 200 volunteers joined, and this massive scale search went on for days. On day 2 of the search, May 28, 1992, a body was found by a man on an ATV, and this was about a 15-minute drive from Brandy's home. The man who found this body saw thick, oversized glasses and immediately thought he had found Brandy Myers. But the investigators knew that this body could not be Brandy's based on the state of the remains. This was someone who had been dead longer than 2 days. It was determined that this victim had been strangled to death and there was a rope found near her body. Though they knew this could not be Brandy, it was hard to ignore the similarities. This was a teenager, likely a couple years older than Brandy, who had blonde hair and thick, oversized glasses, just like Brandy. And with the similarities in their appearances, there was a question about if the cases were possibly linked by a killer who was targeting teens with that description. Connecting the cases beyond that, though, was pretty much impossible for 2 reasons. One, they didn't know what happened to Brandy, so they had no MO to compare it to. And 2, they had no idea who this teen girl was. Investigators ran her description against missing persons cases and open runaway cases and came up empty. She was a teenager who no one seemed to be looking for. All that was known about her was her approximate age and that she was strangled to death before being thrown in a trash heap. There was a composite sketch created, but no one came forward to identify her, so she was buried as Jane Doe number 92-1169, and she remained a Jane Doe for 19 years, which turned out to be longer than she had been alive. She ended up being identified in 2011 after Maricopa County had gotten a federal grant to help identify some of the Doe cases that they had. The money was used to pay both for forensic testing, like DNA, but also pay to dedicate detectives to doing the old-fashioned police work in tracking down leads. This Jane Doe had been on everyone's radar since the day her body was found, so it's not surprising, even all those years later, that she was on the list for the first year of this program. The first step was to have her body exhumed for DNA collection. Then the detectives poured over 1,600 reports of teenage runaways from 1991 through 1994 who could possibly be this victim. And they didn't limit themselves just to open cases. They looked at cases of runaways who were later located because the thought was she could be a chronic runaway who wasn't reported missing every single time. And then they looked a couple of years after 1992, after the body was found, in the event there was a delay in reporting her missing. We love to see this kind of critical thinking. The detectives spent months crossing off names as they found proof of the various young women being alive past 1992. Eventually, they had this list down to the final 100 or so names of runaways that matched the Jane Doe's description, but didn't have easily found proof that they were alive, such as a driver's license or even an arrest record. They then took this final list and alphabetized it so they could start at the top and start looking into each person more deeply to see if they could find them. But they didn't make it too far through the list. They got to 16-year-old Shannon Amok, and she was a solid possibility. She had a history of running away from foster care. She had been reported missing 40 times, and the last time she was reported as a runaway, she was eventually found and returned to her placement. But they found absolutely no proof she was alive past 1992. The next step in this case was to locate Shannon's biological family to get a DNA sample. They were able to find her birth mother, and using DNA in March of 2011, they were able to conclusively prove that Jane Doe number 92-1169 was Shannon Amok. Shannon's life was nearly as tragic as her death. Detectives referred to her as a throwaway child. Her birth mother had been sexually assaulted at 16 and became pregnant with Shannon. She tried to raise her, but eventually turned her over to child services when she was 3. Shannon was eventually adopted into a family that seemed prepared to meet her needs, but they weren't. As Shannon got older, her behavioral issues became more severe. At 10 years old, she was already running away and having run-ins with the law. Her adoptive family took her to get help, and the therapist asked her in one session, what did she want her tombstone to say, since her running away was dangerous and it could end in her death. It sounds like he meant this as a little bit of a shock to her system to dissuade her from continuously putting herself in dangerous situations. But instead of that, Shannon just said that her tombstone should be blank. Since no one cared for her in life, why would they care after her death? She was around the age of 10 to 12 when she said this. Her adoptive parents placed her back into the system at the age of 12. So we have a 12-year-old who has a history of behavioral issues and clearly attachment issues, losing yet another family. Shannon repeatedly ran away from her foster placements, both home placements and group homes. In early 1992, she spent some time in a juvenile facility, and within a month of her release to a group home, she ran away. This time, no one reported her missing, and Child Services later petitioned the court to have her removed from their responsibility since she could not be located. They lost a minor child in foster care. They made the court aware that they didn't know where she was, but this did not trigger a missing persons report. So, it turned out that the detectives in 2011 thinking to look at closed runaway reports was the right idea. Had Shannon been reported a runaway in 1992, she never would have been buried as a Jane Doe. It's only because the detectives thought to look at those closed cases that Shannon was ever identified. That was a bit of an aside that happened during the search for Brandy, but I really feel like Shannon's story is important to tell for two reasons. One is that she was murdered, the case is unsolved, and she mattered. And two, it's possible that this case is linked to Brandy's. We really don't know. Brandy wasn't a runaway, but she was walking through the neighborhood by herself, which made her vulnerable to a predator. But this was 5 p.m. on a weeknight, so the investigators at the time were thinking surely someone saw something. And in talking with people in the neighborhood, they did have one witness come forward, and I'm going to call her Jill because she was a minor when all of this happened. Jill was a teenager who was the same age as Brandy, and they lived in the same apartment complex. She told the police that she was actually with Brandy that evening when she went to go collect the readathon money. Then Brandy wanted to go to the store to spend that money on candy and toys, so the two walked to the Smitty's grocery store. Jill said she went into the store's bathroom, and when she came out, Brandy was gone. She said it was around 7 p.m. So this statement is telling us that the last place Brandy was seen was the grocery store, and she was there after the point her mom Cheryl had already come home and begun searching for Brandy herself. The investigation had been looking at the path from Brandy's apartment to the school, since that's where she was supposed to be. But Smitty's put her in the opposite direction of the apartment complex, almost a mile away from the school. They did have scent dogs pick up Brandy's scent at Smitty's, but that was the neighborhood grocery store, and they always shopped there. The dogs could have been picking up on an old scent trail.
When you're in winter's favorite town, the snow-covered mountains surround you. A historic Main Street charms you. And every day brings a new adventure. Welcome to Park City, Utah. Naturally, winter's favorite town. Join the experience at visitparkcity.com.
This tip about Smitty's is included in most of the coverage on Brandy's case, including on NCMEC and the Charlie Project. But it didn't make sense to Brandy's sister Kristen when she started, as an adult, looking into the case. For one thing, Smitty's was outside of the area Brandy was allowed to roam. She only had permission to go from their apartment to the school and back. That was it, and Brandy was a rule follower. And speaking of being a rule follower, Brandy taking money that was supposed to go for a fundraiser at school and going to buy toys and candy with it instead, that wasn't like Brandy at all. Brandy was really looking forward to contributing to this field trip. I mean, I know she was 13 and 13-year-olds can rebel in unexpected ways, but this was so far outside of Brandy's character that it just struck Kristen as odd. We do have to consider that maybe Jill had pressured Brandy into it. Brandy was a people pleaser, but that only made Kristen wonder even more, why were Jill and Brandy together at all? Kristen wasn't just Brandy's sister, she was her best friend. So Kristen knew that Jill was not a friend of Brandy's. It was quite the opposite. Jill was one of the girls that picked on Brandy, and Brandy would not have gone alone with her, even if Jill tried to get her to hang out for whatever reason. Jill wasn't someone Brandy necessarily felt safe with. We do know that Brandy had gone door to door where she was supposed to be. The neighbors along that path came forward and told the police that they saw Brandy as she knocked on doors between her apartment and the school. As far as I can tell, no one reported seeing Jill with her. The last neighbor to see Brandy was a couple who lived close to her school. The people who lived right next to them weren't home at the time, and then no other neighbor past that point admitted to seeing Brandy after she knocked on that last door. But then Jill said Brandy collected the money and they went to the Smitty's. So that then pulled the investigation from the houses near the school and focused it on the grocery store. So clearly this tip was pivotal, as in they pivoted the investigation to follow up on it. Because it was so important where Brandy was last seen, and the story Jill told didn't make complete sense to Kristen, she wanted to find out the details of what was exactly said. So she reached out to Jill, now that they were both adults, to see what happened and what Jill remembered. Maybe get some more specific details than what she could find in the reporting. To Kristen's surprise, Jill outright denied she had ever made that statement to the police. She said she didn't tell the police that she and Brandy were at Smitty's together, and in fact, she hardly remembered Brandy's disappearance at all. It is odd that Jill didn't really remember Brandy's disappearance. The apartment complex they lived in was not a massive complex. The neighbors were aware of each other, and if cops were swarming in one area, everyone would know about it and could see what was going on. There was a helicopter in the sky over the neighborhood that night with a spotlight. The police were everywhere. Jill also went to school with Brandy, and this was what everyone was talking about. It seems odd that she doesn't really remember it. We're not talking about a 5 or 6-year-old. She was 13, so you would think she would remember more. Kristen told me that she felt like Jill was distancing herself from the case. My first thought was that maybe Jill saw more than she had said, and that's why she's trying to say she doesn't really remember much because she doesn't want to say what really happened. But Kristen has a different opinion. She thinks that Jill was probably a child looking for attention in the situation, so she came up with a story that gave her that attention. Now that she's an adult, she can appreciate the consequences of what she did, but instead of calling the police and trying to recant her statement and make it right, she's just denying involvement entirely. An alternative explanation is that in interviewing all of the kids in the neighborhood, Jill's name got attached to a statement that had been made by someone else. I mean, in the case file, Jill's real name is definitely attached to the statement, so someone said it, and the police say it was Jill. I think the most likely explanation is that she did make this statement, but I am trying to think of all the possibilities of why her name got attached to the last sighting of Brandy and has stayed attached for 30 years, even though she is now denying it. The idea that the search moved from the last place Brandy was actually seen to a place she may never have been at is upsetting because it fills us with a lot of what ifs. What ifs that we'll never have answers to, so we really can't spend too much time dwelling on it. Regardless of where Brandy really was last seen, I have to say that this area was pretty well searched. There were about 200 volunteers who came in, which included some from an organization called Emergency Search and Rescue, Inc. This was a civilian search group, and a few weeks into the search for Brandy, a 15-year-old girl accused the leader of this group of luring her into the command center trailer and sexually assaulting her. It turned out he had similar accusations against him from other teen girls in a different area. So we have a man searching for a missing teen girl who had multiple credible accusations of sexually assaulting teen girls. Now, reading this, I immediately go all Criminal Minds on it and think, oh, he was trying to insert himself into the investigation because he was involved. But he was investigated and ruled out in Brandy's case, not in the other cases. But it wasn't long before another possible suspect emerged. 32-year-old Scott Lair was arrested and charged for a year-long spree involving at least 5 rapes and 1 murder. But they suspected him in 2 more murders and at least 4 more rapes. The victims in those cases were ages 10 to 47, so a wide range. But the majority of them had one feature in common. They were small. Even the adults were mostly on the shorter side and weighed around 100 pounds. Brandy, at 13, was small for her age. Scott Lair also lived less than half a mile from Brandy's apartment, and just south of that Smitty's grocery store where she may have been last seen. In the end, he was convicted of 3 murders and multiple rapes, kidnappings, and sexual assault-related crimes. The surviving victims in all of these cases told a pretty similar story about willingly getting into the vehicle with him, taking rides from a seemingly friendly stranger. 2 or 3 said he had a baby car seat in the back of the car, and I imagine that made him look even more like just an everyday guy and not a threat. So we have to ask, would Brandy have gotten into this man's car? She was naive and trusting, so she may have, except I'm not sure how likely it would have been that she would have taken a ride when she was so close to her home anyway. Whether she was by the school or by Smitty's, she wouldn't have been that far from her apartment. Aside from proximity, there isn't a lot connecting Scott Lair to Brandy's case. He was arrested a month after she went missing, and nothing in his vehicle or home connected him. The possible link was reported in articles about his arrest, so it is clear they were looking into this from day one. But in late June 1992, the police told the media that they had lots of tips, no leads. So while they were looking into Scott Lair as a possible suspect, it doesn't sound like they felt very confident about it. In October of 1992, 5 months after Brandy's disappearance, her mother Cheryl did an interview and said that she did suspect Scott Lair had been involved in whatever happened to her daughter. But then when the 1-year anniversary of Brandy's disappearance came around, Cheryl had changed her mind and she believed that Brandy could still be alive. She told the Arizona Republic that Brandy was just so sweet and so loving that she couldn't imagine anyone wanting to hurt her. She said that maybe someone thought they needed Brandy more than she did, and Brandy could be living with another family. Cheryl would look for Brandy when they were out and about, one time seeing a girl get into a car at a grocery store who she thought was Brandy. She ended up following them until they pulled up to their house and the teen got out of the car and she wasn't Brandy. Brandy's father, Daryl, was interviewed for this anniversary article as well, and he said that he spoke with 3 psychics who all told him Brandy was still alive. 2 said she was in Pennsylvania, and 1 said she was in Northern California. Even though they weren't telling exactly the same story, this gave him hope that she was still alive and that one day they would find her. The last public interview I found with Cheryl was with the Arizona Republic in January of 1999. Earlier that month, 11-year-old Mikkel Biggs went missing from Mesa, Arizona. Mikkel had been outside on her bike waiting for the ice cream man with her sister Kimber. Kimber went back inside and her mom told her to go call for Mikkel to come in. When Kimber got out to the front of the house, Mikkel was gone. Her bike was on the ground with the wheel still spinning, and her quarters for ice cream were on the sidewalk. Investigators timed it, and Mikkel was alone for around 90 seconds. And that's when they believe that someone pulled up, grabbed Mikkel, likely put her in a car, and took off. The reason this article stood out to me was that I was seeing Cheryl's name in print commenting on the Mikkel Biggs case, hoping that her family didn't have to wait as long for answers as theirs did. But Mikkel, like Brandy, has not been found. And in more recent years, Mikkel's sister Kimber has become an advocate just like Brandy's sister Kristen did. And there are multiple articles about the two of them together alongside Sarah Turney, who has advocated for her sister Alyssa, who went missing from Phoenix in May of 2001. I can't imagine Cheryl or the journalist writing this article imagined how many years later Brandy and Mikkel's names would be mentioned side by side. In this interview with Cheryl, she talked about the outpouring of the community in the first few weeks of Brandy's disappearance. Her classmates made cards, someone sent Kristen a doll to keep her company until Brandy got back, 200 people showed up to search, and then they were gone. The outreach to the family and the support dried up while they were still sitting there in the same place they were on May 26, 1992. They still didn't know where Brandy was. The world was moving on. That's not an indictment on those people, but really the reality of having experienced a tragedy. The world moves on, even when we don't or when we can't. So I'm just going to say this right now, that as you're listening to this, this is your sign to reach out to that person in your life. Maybe they lost their parent last year. Maybe they lost their spouse 2 years ago. Maybe they lost a child 7 years ago. This is your sign that you need to find that person in your life, because we all have them. And the older we get, the more of them we have. And reach out. Let them know that you're thinking about them. You're remembering them and you're remembering with them. As Cheryl sat for that interview in 1999, Brandy's case was fading from public view. And it must have felt like no one else remembered. And Cheryl, at some point, just couldn't sit down for these interviews any longer. As Cheryl dealt with her own grief, she still had to raise Kristen, and she struggled. Kristen was left with a shell of a childhood. The family stability they had before Brandy's disappearance was completely gone. And for a while, Kristen's adult life was a reflection of the trauma of her childhood and the aftermath of losing her sister. She speaks openly, not just about her substance abuse, but more importantly, her recovery. For years, she denied that Brandy's disappearance really impacted her life that much. But when she was exploring the root of her substance abuse issues so that she could start healing, all paths led back to that day. She realized how much survivor's guilt she carried, particularly because she didn't go door to door with Brandy. And as you can imagine, her last words to Brandy about her being a nerd really haunted Kristen for years and years and years. This was really just one of those things siblings say to each other and then it's forgotten the next day. Or Brandy would have come home and said it hurt her feelings, Kristen would have apologized, and they would be back to being best friends by bedtime. But when Brandy didn't come home, these last words Kristen said followed her. She was just a kid, but it took her a while to start seeing it that way. After realizing how trauma had led to her substance abuse, and also recognized the trauma that she experienced while she was in active addiction, Kristen has been able to support so many other people on their journeys by being someone they can unload the worst of their stories to, and she can say, I've been there, I've done that, and now I'm in recovery. If I can do it, you can do it. So Kristen rebuilt her life, got a solid footing under her, and realized that it all came back to Brandy. So she became the family contact with the police and the spokesperson to the media as she tried to get attention back on her big sister. Remind everybody she's still missing. And her ultimate goal was to find out what happened to Brandy. That looked like an impossible task when 200 searchers and several detectives hadn't managed to do it. But then 2015 happened. Kristen got a call from the detectives. She had forged a pretty good relationship with the ones assigned to Brandy's case at that point, and they kept her updated as much as possible. The problem was the updates were usually that there wasn't much to update, but this time they were calling to tell her that there had been a major break in the case. An arrest had been made in 2 other cold cases from the same area in the same time frame, and they believed this man was a solid suspect in Brandy's disappearance. And to explain the connection, we need to talk about those 2 cases. On November 8th, 1992, just over 5 months after Brandy disappeared, Angela Brasso went out on a sunset bike ride along the Arizona Canal in Phoenix. Angela's boyfriend Joe was home baking a cake for her 22nd birthday, which was the next day. When Angela didn't come home for a couple of hours, Joe went out to look for her along the canal, which is where he knew she had planned to ride. When he couldn't find her, he called friends and family who also didn't know where she was. He then reported her missing.
When you're in winter's favorite town, the snow-covered mountains surround you. A historic Main Street charms you. And every day brings a new adventure. Welcome to Park City, Utah. Naturally, winter's favorite town. Join the experience at visitparkcity.com.
The next day, in a field along the trail Angela had been riding, a headless body was found and was identified as likely being Angela Brasso. 10 days later, her head was found in the canal by a fisherman. She had been sexually assaulted, stabbed, mutilated, and decapitated. 10 months later, in September of 1993, 17-year-old Melanie Burness was out on a bike ride along the canal. Her mother was out for the evening, and when she came home to Melanie not being there, her first thought was that she broke curfew. So she started calling her friends to see if Melanie was with them, but no one had seen her. The next day, a woman named Charlotte was on a morning bike ride along the canal when she went through a puddle. There was something about the puddle that was strange, so she turned around to check it out, and that's when she realized it was blood. She then saw drag marks off of the trail, and that's when she knew something was very, very wrong. She called the police, who went out to the area to check it out, and that's when they found Melanie's body. Like Angela, Melanie had been stabbed and mutilated with injuries in the same locations on her body as were on Angela's. But something that was really strange in Melanie's case is that her clothes had been removed, and she had been redressed in a teal bodysuit. Melanie had also been sexually assaulted, and in 1999, DNA from both cases was tested and then compared. It confirmed that they were looking for the same perpetrator in each case. So let's fast forward to 2014, and while at a professional conference, the investigators learned about using familial DNA in cases where the perpetrator's DNA profile is known but has not yet been matched. This is the same idea behind how the Golden State Killer was found, and that case is often credited as the first win for forensic genetic genealogy because it got them all the way down to a single name. But some people think that this case should get the credit because it got them on the right track. Now, for those of you who have followed the developments of forensic genetic genealogy, this name is going to be familiar to you. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick started exploring this concept back in the early 2000s, and it was so new at the time that she couldn't find a publisher interested in her first book on the topic, so she ended up self-publishing it. In 2014, Dr. Fitzpatrick was trying to get more people on board with what could be done by combining DNA technology with good old-fashioned genealogy research. So she talked to the detectives from Phoenix about her process at the time, which would trace the Y chromosome. They decided to go ahead and try it, so they sent Dr. Fitzpatrick the Y DNA profile from the Canal murders. Using publicly available databases, they got 6 partial hits to people with the surname Miller. Miller is the 7th most common surname in this country, so it may not have seemed like a lot of help, but it was a lot more than what they had before, which was no last name. The detectives took the name and started looking at their log of tips and leads to see if anyone with the name Miller had come up before. And they found someone. Back in 1994, someone called in a tip about a man named Brian Patrick Miller. And since I'm using all 3 of his names, you know he must be a serial killer. They went ahead and ran a background check on him and found out that back in 1992, Brian Miller was just 20 years old. But even though he was young, he already had a violent criminal record. When he was 16 years old, he got off the bus behind a 24-year-old woman named Celeste, and as she was walking towards work, she felt like this young man had punched her in the back and ran off. It took her a second to realize that he had actually stabbed her in what appeared to be a completely random attack. The police arrived so quickly that Celeste was still in the ambulance at the scene when they pulled Brian in front of her and asked if he was the attacker. She identified him, he later pleaded guilty, and he was in a juvenile detention center until he turned 18. While he was locked up, his mother went through his things at the house and found a note that said, quote, "Plan videotaped" at the top. Step 1 was, quote, "Kidnap the girl." And the rest of the list was a checklist on how to rape, murder, and dismember someone. She turned this paper over to the police, and at this point, his own mom was so scared of him that when Brian turned 18 and was released from juvenile detention, she wouldn't let him come home. Instead, he ended up living in a halfway house in Phoenix. Brian then had another arrest in 2002 for what looked like a similar crime. At this point, he was no longer living in Arizona, but rather in Washington. What happened turned out to be a case of he said, she said. According to a woman named Melissa, she was walking when a man pulled over. She recognized the driver as Brian, someone her friend knew, so she got into his car and said she needed to go somewhere to make a phone call. He drove her to where he worked so she could use the phone there. As she went to make her phone call, she said that Brian came at her out of nowhere with a knife and stabbed her in the back. They had a bit of a struggle before Melissa got away and called the police. Brian was arrested that night, but he had a different story. According to Brian, Melissa was never in his car. He was at work and Melissa walked in and asked to make a phone call. He indicated to the phone she could use, and she looked like she was walking in that direction, but then she pulled out a knife. She was robbing him at knife point. The two had a fight over the knife, and she ended up getting stabbed, but according to Brian, it was self-defense. The police did not believe him, so they charged him with first-degree assault with a deadly weapon. But at trial, the jury did not find that the case was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Brian had spent 7 months in pretrial detention before he was eventually acquitted. After that point, it doesn't look like Brian had a record. He eventually moved back to Arizona, and then after he got a divorce, he gained custody of his daughter. He was known in some circles around town as the zombie hunter due to that being his favorite cosplay outfit. He even bought an old police car and turned it into a zombie hunting version of like the Ghostbusters car, but zombies. People would take pictures with him around town as he's driving this zombie mobile. Even police officers would take pictures with him. It all seemed like it was in good fun and not some kind of violent fantasy, but of course the investigators looking at the Canal murders in 2014 were wondering about that. They knew they needed to follow up on this lead, not just because of the forensic genetic genealogy name, or that tip that came in naming him, or even his previous attack as a teenager. It was really all three of those things that put him as priority number one. But the investigators did not want to tip him off that they were closing in on him if he ended up being the guy, because they didn't want to give him a chance to either get rid of evidence or run. So one of the detectives ended up going undercover. He posed as a security consultant who had an issue with some warehouse that kept getting broken into, and he was looking to hire someone who would basically babysit the building by watching it and then alerting them to any suspicious activity. He found an excuse to start talking to Brian about it, and Brian expressed interest in the job. So the detective arranged for them to meet at a Chili's restaurant on January 2nd, 2015, under the pretense of filling out the job application. Meeting in a restaurant was strategic. They wanted to get Brian's DNA, so they wanted him to eat and drink and then leave the straw behind or a glass or a fork. But Brian ordered a hamburger, which he ate with his hands, and he didn't order a drink other than the water that the server brought over. So the detective waited for him to take a sip of his water. When he didn't, the detective asked him if he was sure he didn't want to order some other drink, and he said no thanks. So if you can imagine it, this detective is undercover trying to play it cool while mentally willing Brian to just take a sip of water. Eventually, Brian did. He took a sip of the water. Once they wrapped the meal up and Brian left, they bagged the water glass. But the detective didn't feel very hopeful. Not that he didn't think they would get DNA from the cup, but more, was this really their guy? Brian had shown up with his teen daughter, who he had custody of, and he really just came across as a nice guy. A little quirky, but he was sweet with his daughter and calm as could be. Could this average Joe really have been capable of the brutality they saw in the murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis? The DNA test results came back a week and a half later with their answer. It was a match. Brian Miller's DNA matched what was left at both murder scenes. They immediately got a warrant, arrested him, and charged him with 2 murders. While they were investigating Brian leading up to trial, the detectives sat down and talked with his ex-wife, Amy. They had met back in 1996 and married within a year. The marriage lasted 8 years, and the investigators were really curious what he was doing in this time. Where did he live? Where did he work? Where did he spend time? Were there any possible cases that could be connected back to him? Amy told the investigators that within their marriage, Brian had expressed violent fantasies, and in one case, he told her about a murder he had supposedly committed. She did not go to the police with this information before this, mostly because she didn't think it was true. She thought that this was a dark fantasy he was telling her about in order to intimidate her. It was a method of control. According to Amy, Brian said that when he was younger, several months, maybe a year after he got out of juvenile detention, he was at his apartment when a teen girl came to his door selling Girl Scout cookies or something similar. He told her that the girl seemed to have some type of intellectual disability, and he either lured her or pulled her into his home. He then stabbed her to death. He went on saying that after she was dead, he put her body in his bathtub and turned on the water. His thought was to use cold water to preserve her body longer, but he accidentally turned on the warm water. Brian said that he tried to still keep the body, but then it started to smell. He dismembered the victim, put the remains in the trash, and waited for trash day. He said the neighbors even complained to him about how badly his apartment smelled, and he told them that he had just cleaned out some bad meat out of his kitchen. When it was trash collection day, he put the bins out, and the remains were taken out to the landfill. The investigators came to believe that this story was the story of how Brandy Myers was murdered. For one thing, it was pretty specific to Brandy's situation. Brandy was going door to door for a fundraiser. It wasn't Girl Scout cookies, but it's not like he was focusing on that detail. She did have learning disabilities, and the time frame tracked. Brandy went missing after he got out of juvenile detention. But the real clincher here was where Brian was living in May of 1992. If you remember from the sightings of Brandy, a couple who lived near the school were the last ones to see her. The occupants of the house next to them weren't home. The very next door, that's where Brian Patrick Miller lived. He lived 2 doors down from the last house that reported seeing Brandy. And this is a big part of why that Smitty's tip has been so frustrating. If it's not true, then the last place Brandy was seen was 2 doors down from Brian Miller's house, whose ex-wife tells a story that sounds like what happened to Brandy. But investigating Brian Miller as a suspect in Brandy's disappearance was difficult after 26 years. If that version of events was true, there's just no way to search a landfill at this point. There's virtually no chance of recovering Brandy's remains, and her family has had to work on accepting that. On top of that, the place he was living at the time had been extensively remodeled, including the bathroom. They still tried to swab the drains in the hopes that maybe they could find a little bit of Brandy's DNA there, but if it ever was there, 20 years of hot, soapy water and cleaning products had destroyed it. They were able to speak with some people who did remember Brian from that time period, and they did remember that there was an awful smell coming from his apartment. And it lasted long enough that they spoke to him about it, which is something Amy included in her story. And how could she have known about that unless Brian had told her? After Brian moved out, the people who cleaned out the apartment said it still smelled bad, and they just threw everything in there away. Though the place he was living at the time was a bust, they did have a second location to search, and that was the home Brian Miller was living in at the time of his arrest. Serial killers occasionally keep trophies, and nothing of Brandy was ever found, so perhaps he kept something like her glasses as a reminder. If they could find something belonging to Brandy among his possessions, that would go a long way to corroborating the story. We have a little problem, though. It's actually a pretty big problem. Brian was a hoarder, and I mean like the TV show. There was basically a path to get through the house between rooms, but everything else was just piled high with junk. Finding evidence from the early 1990s when he had moved several times and accumulated so many belongings was going to be a long shot. Still, the investigators on Brandy's case submitted what they had to the district attorney more than once. They believed they had enough of a case against Brian Miller for the murder of Brandy Myers, but the DA kept coming back to say there just wasn't enough evidence. He wants more, but as Kristen has pointed out, there isn't going to be more evidence at this point. And she feels that the circumstantial evidence is enough, and so do the investigators. Kristen wanted to see Brian Miller stand trial for Brandy's murder alongside the other two he was charged with. And as the trial date just kept getting pushed out more and more and more, there was always hope the charge would be added. But it wasn't. And Brian Miller went to trial in October of 2022, 7 years after his arrest. And he was only facing charges related to the murders of Melanie and Angela. Brian opted for a bench trial with the judge only, and his attorneys argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. They said that Brian's mother was incredibly abusive during his childhood, physically, emotionally, and even sexually, in the sense that she exposed him to pornography as a child. They had an expert testify that he had developed dissociative amnesia, so when he denied killing anyone after his arrest, he thought he was telling the truth. He truly has no memory of killing Angela and Melanie. The judge didn't buy it and found Brian Miller guilty on both charges. At sentencing, Brian did speak, but he said he wasn't looking for sympathy and that time was for the family and friends of the victims. His attorney then asked the judge to spare his life and give him life in prison, but she was not persuaded. She found Brian's childhood abuse was proven as a mitigating factor, but he still deserved the death penalty. Brian Patrick Miller remains the prime suspect in Brandy's disappearance, though that's not the only case they've looked into. Shannon Amok's case has come up at times, though there doesn't seem to be any evidence. I noticed through my research that the juvenile center Brian Miller served his time at for that first stabbing was the same place Shannon Amok had been in early 1992. It looks like Brian was released before she was there, but I would be curious if they did end up with friends in common who overlapped, and they may have connected in the months leading up to Shannon's death. Now that said, Brian Miller stabbed all of his victims. I haven't even mentioned yet another alleged surviving victim of Brian's. After Brian was charged in the murders, a woman in Washington saw his picture and recognized him as a man who had stabbed her when she was 14. It was in 2000 when she was walking on a trail and a man just started stabbing her. She was lucky to survive, but her attacker was never identified. But when she saw his face on TV in 2015, she called the police because she was sure it was him. A quick investigation showed that Brian was living in the area at the time of the attack. He actually lived less than half a mile away. That said, he was not charged because she identified him 15 years after the attack, and attempted murder in Washington has a statute of limitations of 10 years. So while he probably did it, he would never face charges. Brian Patrick Miller stabbed people. He has 2, possibly 3 known living victims, and he has 2, possibly 3 known deceased victims. All of them were stabbed. Stabbing was not something he did just because it's quieter than a gun and easier than strangling. It was the act that he enjoyed. His ex-wife said that he would stick her with pins and needles during sex, which she didn't enjoy but complied with in an attempt to, 1, avoid additional violence, and 2, try to be a good wife since this is what her husband was into. Brian Miller liked stabbing people, but Shannon was strangled, which makes me put him a little less likely on the list of suspects in her case. After Brian Miller's conviction, a lot of media sources hoped to speak to him about these cases he was suspected in, but he ended up responding through email to Brianna Whitney, who is with the Arizona family. The article will, of course, be linked in my sources, but it will also be a link just in the show notes for anyone who wants to read all of it. They get into a lot of stuff we're not going to talk about here, and it's a lot to take in. You have to read it for yourself to get an idea of this guy's mentality. But let's get into the parts that are relevant to us today as we're discussing Brandy's case. The first thing is that Brian said he didn't agree with his attorney's defense that he did it, but forgot. He said he was not guilty of killing anyone. It sounds like he was claiming that his DNA was planted, but he said he wouldn't make that accusation without proof, but he's pretty much saying it without saying it. He wrote that although he disagreed with his legal team, he still thought that they were good people, and he cared about them, and that it's okay to have a difference of opinion. I will say it's a pretty big difference of opinion when they're saying you murdered people, and you're saying you didn't. That's a deal breaker for most relationships, but he seems to still like his attorneys. Brian also outright denied killing Brandy Myers in response to Brianna Whitney directly asking him about it. He said he did remember when she disappeared because he came home from work one evening to find that the main road was blocked off and that there were people out. His first thought was maybe there was a block party he wasn't aware of. But when he went to go see what was going on, he saw that they were handing out flyers of a missing girl. I'm curious which day he's saying this was and if they had the road blocked off for multiple days. Because night one of Brandy being missing, when you would think blocking off the road would have happened, it would have been too early for them to be passing out flyers already. I'd love to know if the road was blocked off on the second or third day and when they got the flyers printed. Basically, I want to fact check any part of his story that we can, but I'm sure it's too late to do a lot of that. Brian claimed he didn't even know Brandy was still missing because he assumed she had been found when the police presence eventually left the neighborhood. The only time he said he ever mentioned anything about a missing kid to his ex-wife Amy was when they were watching a news story about a different missing child. He just commented to her about how he remembered a child going missing in his neighborhood back in the day. Brian claims that his ex-wife Amy would just make statements to hurt him in order to get custody of their daughter, and it seems like that's what he was chalking this up to. But I don't see how this explanation applies. Amy didn't tell this story until he was already arrested and in jail for 2 other murders that he was DNA linked to. I think she had other arguments for custody other than a secondhand story. Trying to explain this away as something to do with custody makes absolutely no sense. If what Amy said is true, Brandy's family has their answers, even if they don't have justice. And Kristen doesn't really care so much about getting additional time tacked on for Brandy's murder or anything like that. This man's on death row. There's nothing else they can do to him. But what she wants is an acknowledgement from the court system, from our justice system, of what happened to Brandy, and allow her to give her victim impact statement. That would mean so much to her. Things have been hard with Brian Miller getting sent to death row without ever facing charges for Brandy. And then within the last year, Kristen and Brandy's mother Cheryl's health declined and she passed away, never seeing justice for her daughter. The last thing anyone wants is for people to stop talking about Brandy's case because they think it's all but solved. There are still questions out there, and most of all, there is still hope for justice. Brandy was 13 when she went missing. If she was alive today, she would be 45. She has blonde hair and blue eyes and needs thick glasses to see well. She also has a scar on her cheek and one on her upper left knee. If you have any information on the disappearance of Brandy Myers, you can call 1-800-THE-LOST. And if you want to follow any updates on the case, I recommend following the Justice for Brandy Myers Facebook page, and I'll leave that link in the show notes. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basement4productions.com/support.